Welcome, everyone, to our next session. Session is entitled Strengthening Defenses Through Practical CTEM Applications. My name is Jay Martang, the field CISO here. I've been with you throughout most of the day, but I'm joined here now by Shira Danker. Shira, thank you so much for joining us. It's very nice to have you on here with us.
Hey there.
Thank you so much for joining us here at Exposure. Let's quickly start with just an introductory. So, who are you and who do you work for? What do you guys do?
Absolutely. I'm Shira Danker. I'm the Director of Security Services at NineStar Connect. We are a combined utility out of Greenfield, Indiana. That means we offer telecommunication services, water, wastewater, and power services, as well as spinning out a cybersecurity division where we help other companies with their pen testing and securing needs.
Nice. So, what other companies is it related to the industry? Is it cross industries? Who do they kind of fall into? What bucket?
Generally speaking, it's within industry. Part of that is because they trust us. We follow the same rules. We know the regulations that are coming down the pipe are already here. And we know what it takes to secure the various devices that we have. I mean, on the telecommunication side, an ISP is essentially inviting people onto our own network. And on the power side, I mean, SCADA devices and connectivity is king right now.
Yeah, totally. So is it naturally there must be an awareness that something needs to be done? What are they engaging you for? What's driving it? Is it compliance? Is it just general awareness? Like, look at all these attacks that are happening. What do you think that is?
Honestly, it's a combination of all of the above. It's compliance, it's regulatory, and it's seeing that other people are being attacked and not wanting to also fall victim. A lot of it is regulation is the heavy driver in that one because that one comes with fines or potential loss of revenue or funding. So CISA is putting out CERCIA for comments right now. And basically, that is a reporting requirement for breaches. In addition, there are executive orders that we have to adhere to, and the government is starting to tie cybersecurity plans, supply chain plans, incident response plans, all to funding as well.
Yeah. So compliance driven, but also at the same time, they don't want to, they don't want to be that company and end up on the news, which
Exactly.
makes sense, right? We hear that across the industry as well. So when we start thinking about then the continuous threat exposure management process, starting with the first step of scoping, how do customers determine what's in scope for their testing?
Well, to start with, when we approach water or power companies, there's definitely a what's not in scope conversation, either from us or the customer. And the reason for that is in the CIA triad, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability, SCADA devices and operational technology availability is key. So if we knock those devices over, take them offline, or cause them to stop functioning, it's both bad for the customer, but more importantly, it is a safety issue. So we definitely want to avoid that. As far as what's in scope, a lot of it is going to be your IT or corporate assets. Your external assets are also there. And then we have this small slice of legacy. And legacy devices are something that you want to test, but you also know are potential risks in terms of maybe knocking them over or possibly that you can't just fix them like you would anything else. And no matter how much you scope, honestly, there will be surprise devices that just people either forgot about, they were using for testing, but they're still on the network, or the obligatory temporary permanent type of device.
How is that considered? So we talked about, this is all really good information. You talked about the availability being very critical in regards to scoping, and that naturally will impact a lot of things. But is business impact considered in other areas, even in the IT space at all, when it comes to scoping?
Absolutely. Business impact would be counted as things that an attacker can use to pivot and direct towards whatever the company considers their quote unquote crown jewels. And that differs per company. In some cases, it is getting to the operational technology side. In other cases, it's getting to, say, old board reports or negotiations that are currently in progress, or both. Um, so really, when we're scoping, that part is taking into account in terms of, well, how do they reach that, and what do we test to make sure that doesn't happen?
Yeah. It's always criticality of assets is something that I speak with a lot of customers about. I'm curious your take on what you would consider critical. Of course, it may vary, right? But if someone were to ask you, what would you say?
Critical is whatever your business risk tells you is critical. That is different for me in my infrastructure versus our customers and their infrastructure. I wish I could give you just a guide, but frankly, it may surprise you what other businesses consider critical.
No, I think that's the right answer, right? And you said something that truly resonates with me is really the business. It needs to come down to the business, and that should govern, where the security practice is going. So I'm completely with you there. You mentioned a little bit of the external attack surface. Do you think organizations have a good understanding of that today? Yes, no, maybe, why you feel the way you feel based on what you see in your experience.
I think it's a mixture. So originally I would have said no, but there has been a big push for security awareness. So there's definitely getting into, it's not just your web server that happens to hang out there, which most people think of when they think of your external access. Because historically, hackers would go after your external assets to find a way in. These days, it's not quite so simple. First of all, attacking your users is so much easier. Just click on a phishing email and you're already in the network. But other than that, passwords and shadow IT and simply looking to see if maybe an employee let loose some info they shouldn't have. All of those are valid attack surfaces. Never mind that the move to Office 365, cloud, and SaaS apps means that you have opened up what your attack surface actually is, and it's no longer the things behind the firewall. It is now the things on the other side of the firewall that are coming in.
100%. I feel like it's very, very porous, right? A lot of holes, a lot of gaps, and places that attackers can get their hooks in. But naturally, after getting their hooks in or crossing perimeter, or however you want to call it, right? They need to discover, which moves us to the second phase of the process, things in the environment. Now, as we talk about ourselves as defenders or trying to protect ourselves from threat actors, how are you going about discovery, especially with those legacy devices that you mentioned earlier?
So the legacy devices, generally speaking, the customer will have some sort of a list. And usually this comes off as the customer apologizing to us,
Hmm.
saying, I know I have these. Please understand we're not terrible at cybersecurity. We just have to have them. And so part of that conversation is reassuring them that everyone has something like that. Maybe your security system had a Windows 7 server that you then had to get rid of, but it was hard and it cost money. So there's nothing to be embarrassed about there. And that's reassuring them to get, them moved on to the next topic. But when we do discovery, we find out what devices that are talking on the wire, as well as what devices we can run a scan on. And all of those devices go into the discovered items. From there, we can start building device profiles, such as, is that a Windows machine, a Linux machine? What are the operating systems? What ports are open? And therefore, what services are being offered?
Mm. So how has that been augmented along your journey? Whether it's talking about process, continuous threat exposure management. I mean, how have you seen gains in that area?
Honestly, automation has helped a lot. Running one tool after another isn't as efficient as running an automated tool at the very beginning. That takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. If I could just hit something that would then run the scans I want to run off the bat, and then what I need to do is analyze the results of that rather than doing kind of a onesie twosie search for that. That definitely helps. In addition, just being able, like tools, we all know of them, where they go out, they scan the ports, and then they make an educated guess, honestly, based on the characteristics that show up. I can tell you, we are a Pantera customer. And so when we run the tool, it will tell us basically, is that a domain controller? Is it Windows? And is it Linux? What ports are showing up? What's the operating system? That kind of thing.
Gotcha. And it's more, I believe, the discovery process is more of just, devices and profiling, which I think is absolutely necessary, but it's also discovering vulnerabilities, things like misconfigurations. How were you doing this traditionally, trying to figure out if there were, misconfigurations on the network or on devices?
Traditionally, you would ask the customer, hey, what services are you using? Let's go look at those. And you would go look at those, and then you'd start to explore a little what you think they might be using. You'd listen on the wire, you'd look at device profiles, that kind of thing. And also, each of those things, so let's say VMware versus Active Directory, has their own configuration guide versus Office 365 or Azure. And so you would have to go in each one of those and start poking around and prodding and checking against best practices or benchmarks.
Wow. So would you say that, and this is your opinion, are, are findings expected or are they unknown? Is it usually like surprise Pikachu face, like, oh my gosh, or is it like, no, we understood this, or is it just what do you see when it comes to how you
I
work with
think
customers?
it's generally expected, however, not the breadth and depth of it, just because the default configs are not your friend. Default configs are put into place to get the product up and running as fast as you can with the fewest amount of vendor interaction. So defaults really should be changed. That is my opinion and my opinion alone.
I would
But
agree with your opinion, but that's
there,
fine.
but when it comes to explaining that to a customer, you have to be very careful. And part of that is because you have to take into account that one of their employees, usually the tech person who's standing right in front of you, is the person who configured that. And what you don't want to do is go in and badmouth their work or denigrate what they've done. You have to understand what they did was to get the business up and running. So it's more of a business efficiency versus cybersecurity balance, and understand what side they sit on. They may not have known, they may have had a deadline, et cetera, et cetera. And so I hate to say it like this, but create a safe space in order for them to receive what you're trying to tell them and not play the blame game. Because the other part to understand here is when you have a pen test done, what you're telling the customer is, here's some more work for you. You weren't overworked to begin with, but here, I have 500 items for you to now also work on.
So you mentioned something that's important, that we're going to revisit, which is communication. But part of that communication is taking what was found and helping to prioritize, which is the next stage. So whether it's, oh, we found defaults or we found XYZ, these misconfigured, these vulnerabilities or whichever, how are you prioritizing then the vast amounts of data that is out on the network that you're discovering?
So part of this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The very first step is whatever the business has said their crown jewels are, that is going to jump to the top of the queue because that's really what they're looking for. After that, as I said earlier, we are a Pantera customer, and part of that comes with both remediation guides and prioritization, which is very helpful. So when we run these scans and we start talking to the customer, generally what we're doing is we're taking the achievements, the ranked achievements, and the ranked vulnerabilities and discussing the top items first. Not only that, but we have a flow chart of the attack itself to get to domain admin, for example, or sensitive documentation. And we can show that if they do this one thing, which honestly is usually SMB signing or some sort of using SMB 2.0, if they do that, then SMB relay is not possible. So you're not going to move around the network and get to the next step. In addition, LLMNR, NetBIOS, those are, the enemies you invited in. And so shutting that down will also stop some of the listening on the wire attacks as well.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing correctly, it's really using the attack chain process to prioritize and stop kind of higher in the chain, right?
Exactly.
The legacy intrusion kill chain analysis, but just doing it with the tool that you're using, happens to be Pantera in this case. Okay.
Correct. For example, if we saw Eternal Blue, which,
Hmm.
wreaked havoc on the world. If we saw that, that would be priority number one, because with that, you could get anywhere.
Hmm. Yeah. So what do you say now that we move on to validation, which I think is such a key critical portion of the continuous threat exposure management framework? What does validation mean for you?
Well, for me, it means when I've done a good job, someone comes in and says, "Hey, you've done a good job," and they absolutely will accept a medal for that too. But I don't think that's really what you were asking me.
Yeah, no, but I'm with you.
Um, so validation means for me is a part of the pen test or a part of the experience, and not something that's just tagged on at the end. The reason I say that is, much like IT work and no one likes to do documentation or verification, it still is a part of the process. There's no point in pointing out that XYZ needs to be resolved, and then once that is done, testing again to make sure that you actually did resolve it. Otherwise, it's kind of just hanging out there as a possibility. You don't really know if it's resolved. You're just kind of trusting that it might work.
Yeah. So what you mentioned how are you doing this before, and then how has it changed in your process? I think before, like seeing before and after and how you've made gains is always important to understand, because it might be a repeatable process, right, for anyone who's listening.
Absolutely. So before, and I should clarify, when we use Pantera, we use it to test customers, but we also use it internally. So let me speak about our process internally on this one. Um, Prior to using a tool that we can just use and is automated and will always be the same, what you would have to do is you'd have to read through your pen test report, try to install all the tools they used, because a good company will tell you what they used and vaguely what configurations. Installing it alone is a process, we'll just say. They don't really like to all work together sometimes. And then you would have to run the tool, make sure you're running it correctly, and see what the result is and hope that it is resolved. So that happens for every item that involves that tool. It's kind of a long process. And then, depending on what your pen testing cycle is, you would wait to the next one, um, to see if it actually worked, or you ran the tool correctly, or you didn't.
So are there any metrics you could speak to?
Metrics on that one, not quite for automation.
Hmm.
What I can speak to is the metrics of going through a penetration test, starting from zero to tell your bosses or the board or directors where it was to begin with, and then showing your progress as you resolve things. Um, what I always advise is definitely start from zero,
Hmm.
because IT is kind of a black box to people who aren't in IT. All
Hmm.
they see is you did nothing and suddenly we're fixed, because they don't understand. So if you can clearly show that you started from zero, you spent X amount of hours on something, and then you can show that this, that, and the other are now resolved, that definitely helps them understand.
Well, you're touching on a great point, which is the last part of that process, which is the mobilization, right? The communication. How do you help you to talk to me a little bit more about how you're communicating and getting folks to make those changes, reducing friction, all of that, because there's always friction, right? So how do you get around
There
that?
is. Please understand that IT people in general, the people doing hands-on keyboard, aren't the people who are hiring us. The people who are hiring us are managers or directors.
Mm,
So when we walk into a place, there's always a little bit of friction the first time, just because the IT people understand that we are there to basically criticize their work.
mm,
And we don't want that. We definitely go in and we identify with them. I'm, for example, a defender. I have done the same resolutions that I'm recommending and gone through the same heartache in cutting off printers, for example, by trying to fix some things. So the very first thing we do is we explain everything from the voice of a defender, in that, yes, I know this is more work. I absolutely understand. You just wanted to get this thing up and running. Totally get it. Here are the things we need to do. Here are some of the pitfalls you're going to fall into. And here are some of the decisions that someone needs to make to see if we go with mitigation instead of resolution, because of what the business needs to run.
No, that's great. I mean, do you use anything, the empathy, I completely feel you, right? Because everyone is just trying to get their jobs done. So you don't want to completely understand what you said. I love the way you framed it. Um, is there anything else that you're using, ticketing systems, like things like that, that help with that? Do you work with customers and what they already have to make things a little bit easier?
Generally speaking, what we do is we use both the Pantera report and the remediation guide and give that to customers and then answer any questions they have going forward. Internally, we use a ticketing system whereby when we get pen test results, it goes into the system and we have to work internally with the system administrators and the network administrators to resolve those issues. So a ticketing system makes it really easy to start from zero and show what we've done and where we've gotten to my boss, which justifies my continued employment. So that's nice for me.
Cool. So I think we're approaching time. I think just my last question for you is anyone who's wants to get involved with this process and what you've been doing, where should they start? Where's a good place to begin?
Honestly, I would start by reading the benchmarks.
Mm.
That is my rank and file advice. Start by reading the benchmarks and understand that your default configurations are not where you want to be. Also understand the process of compliance is to getting you to the starting point. Compliance is not where your end goal should be. Your end goal should be far beyond compliance. Understand that the reason compliance exists is to get everyone to at least some level of baseline. But again, it's not the end of your journey.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Completely resonates with me. A lot of those basic hygiene points you got to start somewhere, right? And that's a great place to start. So, Shira, I'll take this opportunity just to thank you for your time. Really appreciate you joining us and bringing your real world experience to exposure here.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks.
A big thank you to Shira for sharing her valuable insights on CTEM across the industry. There's nothing quite like hearing firsthand how these strategies are being applied in real-world scenarios. To wrap up our day, we have Zach Lewis, AVP of IT and CISO at the University of Health Sciences and Pharmacy in St. Louis, Missouri. Zach's going to walk us through a real-life Lockbit ransomware attack, from breach to recovery and the lessons learned in between. Please welcome Zach Lewis.